Hi, and welcome to another episode of Mindset Mondays, where we will be dealing with team dynamics, individuals in this kind of a setup, and how is it that they are, what are the pressures that they're likely to face, what are all the challenges, or is there a challenge at all, is what we're going to discuss. Again, we have with us Purnima Rajan, and we will start off with something that's happening very currently. There's a lot of, in terms of cricket, which is the sport that I work with, a lot of selections and getting into the team is happening now. So if we were talking about it, we start with the youngest age group. There are age group cricket that happens, and then there are players who've transitioned from age group. They finish age group and move on to the next level. So where I'm going to start off with you is this transition. Okay, there are players who transition from say an age group cricket like an under 19 into the seniors or in between team called the under 23. When they are transitioning, very often it's possible that their skills are recognized. But this being a team environment and how you work outside of the field is also as important to get performances going. How do you think that there is a possibility, and it's a very real possibility, that the same person who's recognized for the skill on the field is not made to feel necessarily a part of the team of the field? Then how is it a chance that their performance could come down on the field, or that can remain independent?
Okay. So, in a team sport, communication is extremely vital. It's both on the field and off the field. Communication is very important. One of the things that the player very often is left to figure out is the expectations of their performance or their participation in the sport. So that it's important to set that expectation right. It is also important for um, the staff to kind of make sure that they communicate to the player as they're moving up levels, whether it's under 15, under 19, and all the way up to the senior space. It helps them cope with any changes that they're having in terms of how many games they're playing, what the training modules would look like, and thereby their ability to participate and work well with the team also gets better. Similarly, within the group as well, how well they're able to communicate together in order to ensure that there is an adjustment period for everyone who's entering into a team, right? So how well or how comfortable the adjustment can be, it's very, very important. So it's entirely based on how well we're able to communicate to the player and how well the player is able to communicate back to us.
So you're basically saying have the and very open line of communication, tell them their expectations. So make it very, very skill based initially before you move on to the dynamics of the team.
Exactly. So skill is something that everyone can relate to. So it's great to start with the skill. So they're like your bigger stones in a jar. Then it's easier to communicate the smaller expectations and in what ways they need to work in adjustment with the team as well.
All right, good. So pretty much on a similar line, these young players, it's possible that they have certain people that they look up to. Okay, and this person that they look up to may not be exactly responsive the way they thought when they looked up to them, because the dynamics has now changed. Does that or will it be good, that is it better that they go without these set of expectations, where they go, okay, I looked up to this person is not now, the same role is not being played by them towards me? Do they go in like that, or say, no, I need her or him to have as my fallback?
Can you give me an example?
For example, say I look up to you, you are part of the team. I looked up to you, you've helped me when I was not part of your setup. Now say I have come into the team dynamics that you're there. Now you are going to look at me not as a young person anymore. You're going to be looking at me as a peer. So when I as a player, therefore I have to change the way I look at you. I still look up to you as my mentor or whatever. But in the playing dynamics, say you say something to me, is it possible that?
Oh, absolutely. So this is entirely based on relationships, right? And relationships do evolve over a period of time. So when I'm a mentor to you at a senior to junior level, the approach that a senior would have towards the junior or what the junior would have towards the senior will be very, very different. Expectations are also such. But as that gap starts to reduce, there is a change in how the dynamics plays when you're peers. So you're expected to work well with the dynamics. You're expected to understand how this particular dynamics work, and if we are able to cope or if we're able to adjust, it's well. If it's not, then there will be some amount of friction. It's usually there in the initial part of it, But to expect either the senior player or the junior player to continue to establish that, continue to exist in the same dynamic will be a little too much of an ask.
Say, for example, so moving on, on this note, say this mentor and this young player play similar roles. And now the senior feels threatened by this player.
Yes. Yes.
Because they see that, is she actually getting better than me, or he is getting better than me?
Yes.
Now mentor is gone. Now you're a competitor.
Mm-hmm.
Then, like you said, it's a game of relationships. Then relationship changes.
Yeah.
So, what happens when a senior player now in the same dynamics feels threatened by the coming in of a junior cricketer who's as good? How does that senior player now deal with it? Forget the mentor role.
Right.
Even without a mentorship role, a senior player it's very possible that they feel threatened by the coming of a newer, younger player who could probably have similar or maybe better skill sets. But the fact still remains, as a senior player has the experience that this junior player doesn't have.
Right.
Then how is it? How do they cope with that insecurity?
That's a very good question. There are two specific dynamics that you can pay attention to kind of help both the senior and the junior player cope with a competitive environment. Competitive environment can really kill your focus on training, on the game, and so on, because we start becoming very, very aware of what are the other dynamics that are there. You're being evaluated, especially since you said selections is coming up, so you're being evaluated on various parameters. There's a lot of people who are competing for the same role and so on. The focus of the game, if it deters, then their performance does get affected. But if we're able to ensure that the focus is continuous within the training as well as within the performance, usually the outcome, once there is an outcome measure that's there, the fear and the insecurities do tend to kind of die down a little bit. But in the process of going towards selection, definitely these insecurities do pop up. So one thing that will help here is that the player has a person that he or she can reach out to be able to talk a little bit about the insecurities. It's never a good idea to keep insecurities internal, because it will keep growing, it will keep increasing, and thereby can affect performance to some degree, especially the more competitive environment that we get. So it is good for players to have a person that they can talk to. It could be a mentor, it could be a friend, it could be a peer, where they're just expressing and venting out their experience and getting the kind of reassurance to ensure that the focus is back on the game. Another way in which they can deal with this insecurity is to ensure that they establish it's essentially the core of sportsmanship, right? So within the environment of the game, the way they perform, the way they behave, everything is different from what kind of a relationship they can have outside of the game. So this is easier to establish in a single sport event like tennis, but it's a little harder to do when the team dynamic is a little harder. So it's a very good idea if the environment is aware of this and is able to create a secure space for them to detach and re-engage as and when there is a necessity.
It's tough. So the people around them also should have this awareness that this is a very good possibility.
Yeah.
And then how do you deal with that possibility of insecurity with a player? Which means that I, as a coach, if somebody comes to me, I should have my data with me that gives them assurances, ideally numbers, empirical values help more than just words, figurative words. Empirical values always help.
Yes.
So basically, what she's basically trying to say is, as a coach, have your data with you so that your players, when they come to you with questions, you know how to answer them in a very logical way, because not always dealing with them on just the emotional side helps. Give them numbers and logic, they'll relate to you and the problem much better. Good. So going on, there are you brought in this individual sport thing. Now I'm observing there is a trend. It's probably because with cricket there's a lot of popularity coming in. A lot of individual sports players are transitioning into a team sport like cricket voluntarily, not by force. That's a challenge. Because they have been very, very happy doing their own things. Now they have to bend over backwards to they may not get the time that they initially invested. So when it's an individual sport, the time that you get to the sport is yours and yours alone. Here you share the time. What kind of a challenge does that bring to that player who's making the transition?
It's a huge difference. It again comes back to expectations, right? So what you are used to, the rules that you've used to kind of create a parameter of what is successful and what is failing can completely get disrupted when you're in a team environment, right? Because your performance in the game it doesn't just depend on you and your energy levels. It also depends on how the team performs, how well you're able to have a read on your team players, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of other dynamics that comes in place. Setting expectations there again becomes vital. So it's important that the coach is able to do it. It's important that their support systems are able to understand it, and so on. A generalized assumption that you're really good at, let's say an individual sport, thereby you will be really good at this, is probably a false assumption to make. And it's very quick to make as well, because I think it's this rapid growth in both of those sports that we are forced to make decisions very quickly, and that can create a lot more of the difficulties. There are a couple of emotions that a person can feel during the time of adjustments. So the first one is that there is a pressure to perform, right? If you're in the field, and I think like one of the things that we spoke about last time was if a player had started earlier,
Correct.
and their mindset versus a person who starts later
Late.
in life. So it's very similar to that. So a player who's been focused on a particular sport for a much longer period of time, and there's another person who's laterally entering into the sport, there is a difference in how each person perceives each other, right? So that there's a bit of frustration and a pressure to perform there. There is a little bit of a shock and a disillusionment that can also come in, saying I expected the sport or the training to be in a particular way, but once I got in, I'm realizing very quickly that my assumption is really
I
bad.
think that's
So
something I've heard actually.
yeah,
Players say
yeah,
it seems very different. I say it is different. It's
it
not
is.
the same.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, so now what do I do? Do I feel confident about it, or do I feel like I'm out of the water? And that becomes a very harsh reality sometimes for a person to kind of adjust and coming out. The next one is also the sense of disappointment. Like you'll be at the top of the ladder in one sport, but when you start, it's very natural for you to start at the bottom of the pyramid, right? How do we feel about just doing that? Being on top of one sport and then feeling like you're starting afresh. So that can really take your self-esteem and self-efficacy at a whack. So it's very important that the person is given enough orientation and enough knowledge to know that this is a part of the process, and the person builds enough courage to put themselves through it and not just feel that the success ratio should be the same. If a person's well informed, their ability to adjust and adapt is definitely and far better. If they are not informed, then it's very often that the adjustment becomes one of the biggest impediments in their entire
All
success.
right. All right. So moving on from individual sport and team sport and all that, let's get back to the team sport
Hmm.
environment. In India, in cricket, something that I've noticed, and many people know, it's an
Mm-hmm.
unspoken truth
Mm-hmm.
that the most talented player will be made the captain,
Hmm.
not necessarily the best leader.
Hmm.
This always poses a challenge because for me, I look at a person who's a captain as the person who's going to lead me into doing something different, who inspires me.
Hmm.
But this kind of a setup that we have in our country very often does not allow leaders to come through.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, players are also aware
Hmm.
that this person is the better leader, but this is the captain purely based on their skills.
Hmm.
Now, this person who now is the captain understands it. Then what happens?
You can answer this question in two ways, right? One is, um, as an organization, do we take a different choice to say that a leader in the team needs to be a person who can lead the team? Is that an organizational choice that
More
becomes one?
often than not, that,
That
I'm
doesn't
not even
happen.
getting into it. But the thing
So,
is, we are a country where the person who obviously shines the most appears as if they should be the ones also present, be the face of the sport.
hmm, hmm, hmm,
It makes it easy.
hmm, hmm, hmm.
It doesn't matter whether they are the best communicators, whether they push their other players, they are somebody who truly believes in values and systems that they can bring into the team. The face of the sport is promoted to the best player.
Right.
Now, there are many examples in this country where excellent players have failed as captains.
Hmm, hmm, hmm,
But when this happens at a younger level,
hmm, hmm, hmm,
captaincy is thrust. They
hmm.
themselves may not want it because they know they'd rather focus on the game as opposed to trying to manage
Right.
players. how do they go? Then there's very real possibility the performance comes down.
Absolutely.
Then you
Absolutely.
have lost the entire thing. You don't have a leader, you don't have a player.
Right.
How does this player deal? Because
So
it's going to happen.
absolutely. So one is it's important that the way a person is groomed into being a leader is also important. Some tips and tricks to help the person cope with what it means to be a leader of this particular team. Some feedback to the leader saying each of your team dynamics is this is what your team dynamics is. Each player responds positively and negatively in these sort of ways, and this is the way you can go about promoting the team's dynamics. It's a very good idea for people who work with the team to give that qualitative feedback back to the captain. It helps when they take decisions. It helps when there is resistance from teams, when the whole team is adjusting to his captaincy. It helps for the leader to cope with that, the team captain to cope with, okay, the person's behavior, understand the players' behaviors better. So that's a very good first step to take on board. The second thing also is that it's important for the person who's a team captain to understand that if he or she is a team captain, right? The entire sole responsibility is not necessarily something he has to carry on his own. So if he has assets of team players who can support him or her in this endeavor, it's a good idea to ask. It's a good idea to build that as an exercise so that they can shoulder the responsibility in places where he feels that he might need that support as well. It's a good practice to start. Once it starts, it's a really good, it really does blossom. But a lot of the team captains may not even know that that's something that's a possibility.
That comes probably stems from the insecurity of not being able to approach. Like you said, I think
Correct.
at the end of the day, all of it boils down to how well do you communicate
Oh, absolutely.
what you want. So
Team
and
dynamics is very heavily centered on
on
communication
communication.
skills. How much of it is a can do, can't do? A lot of us are forced to figure that out through trial and error.
Hmm.
We're not necessarily aware that we can do certain things, and it's important that as a system, if we let them know that these are possibilities, these are options, these are things that you can ask off of us, it helps them also take a lot of the decisions. It opens up a lot of the spaces for communication.
Okay, let's stick with communication.
Yeah.
What is the kind of communication do you think? Say there is a support staff system that is there. There are about 6, 7 support staff,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a head who leads all of them. So it's very important. Something that I have learned over the many over years is to actually be hands off your staff in order to empower them.
Mm-hmm.
This whole empowering thing itself
Mm-hmm.
is such a difficult concept because you feel you need to be in control, but by giving away that control is when you get in control. Can you explain how this can actually? Is there any, like you said, tips and tricks?
Right. So all of this boils down to what is called as an environment, an organizational environment is what we call it. So every team, in, let's say in a country, in a district, or even just in a place, very unconsciously comes up with certain rules that they feel that they need to follow or they don't need to follow, and so on. Very often, in our culture specifically, we very quickly fall into a hierarchical system of things, right? So okay, who is the person who's the longest, who's been here the longest, they become the senior, or the person who's been put in charge and has been in charge for a while becomes becomes the most advanced person, and thereby very quickly we all conform into that particular space. If we're looking at a change in the dynamics, like you said, between a hands-on and a hands-off approach, it's very important that it comes into every meeting, every communication that you have, saying that from now onwards this is the shift that we're trying to bring. It allows people to figure themselves out, say, okay, if this is a shift that's happening, then how do I go about bringing the shift? So a change of this sort takes somewhere between 3 to 6 months for the group, depending on the size of the group, of course. So if you have a lot more support staff that are there, whether it is the players, the coaches, the physiotherapists, the doctors, the psychologists, and so on and so forth, so getting all of them on board and figure out what is a hands-on hands-off is something that's important. Whether it is a hands-on approach or a hands-off approach, communication is vital. In the sense, everybody in the team needs to know their part, needs to know how they're contributing to the players, and needs to get a feedback of what my contribution has done in terms of the performance. That is a constant. But how that channel of communication happens can be a hands-on and a hands-off approach. So in that sense, it really helps. So right now we have a lot of communication styles, right? There's phone calls, there's messages, there's emails, and so on. So it's important that we get those communication channels well established, so that it makes sure that everybody works well and the communication is not faltering in any sense. If there is a channel that breaks, then very quickly we go back to a hierarchical space where one person knows all the information, then the relevant information is passed on, which can load on a single person a little bit more if the team dynamics become too much, or if too many things are happening around you, So in that sense, it can help.
And because very often what happens, we focus so much on how the player is feeling, we seldom forget that there is a role that there are other support staff.
Mm-hmm.
There is a role that they also play in building the team dynamics. So with
Absolutely.
the players, if they have to put up a united front, they genuinely have to be that way. We've seen so many teams break because the support system has not been together.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
like you rightly said, it very even if there is a head coach, everything cannot fall on that person. They have to monitor that each of these actions are conducted. Like you beautifully said, I think if each of them understand that the role that they have in building a player's career path, yeah, for whatever time frame that they have, and that becomes very crucial. And that's such a lovely point that you made. And for all coaches, support staff over there, make sure, because we are getting into that system, we are going to have a lot of people around us, especially in cricket, and make sure that as the leader or the head coach, you engage all these players equally, treat them equally, make sure they are given independence, and I guess, like she says, communicate. Okay, a last question that
Yes.
I have for you is in terms of, I don't know whether I should be asking this. It's something that we in competition.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a lot of difference the way men handle. uh, When I talk about competition, that there is a selection that happened. I'm going to give you a very example that's happening now. The number of players, athletes playing the sport has increased in cricket.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, there used to be the selection for an under 19 was announced. Getting about 60, 70 odd people used to be difficult.
Mm.
And out of that, the quality used to be easy. So a lot of people actually decided to play the sport because getting your state tag became easy, which meant that your employment opportunities became easy, which means growth was easier. Today, the same under 19, from in the last 4 years, there is a 4 to 5 time increase in the numbers.
Mm. Mm.
Okay, men have had to face this for a long time, and I think their acceptance of being in and not being in, because not just is the competition high, skill levels are high, which is also what is happening now with the women.
Mm.
And they don't give up that easily.
Mm. Mm.
They come year after year. If not, the only advantage is they have a job opportunity which women don't have. How and why do these women or girls or parents of players are quick to say and end all? I don't get it for 3 years, I'm not worth it. That's the immediate feedback or response that they have.
Right.
How are we as coaches going to help them understand this? And competition is increasing. So you may or may not be there, but that does not mean this is not worthless.
Correct.
Because they're attaching their self worth to being a part of a team. Otherwise, they're not. The self worth comes diminishes.
Right. So I think the perceived lifespan of a player in the sport also varies between male and females. I think overall, if we
Correct.
were to subjectively ask a crowd of people what is the average lifespan for a player, it definitely is a lot lesser. So it puts a lot more stress on the women or the girls in the team to have a much shorter time to show their skill sets or show that this is a valid opportunity for them. So in that sense itself, it's a little bit more difficult. The current space, there's a little bit more skepticism for women players in the sport. That's how it is,
It's not
because
gotten better, you feel?
it has gotten better, but we still have a long way to go. And I think this is just generic for all women empowerment. I think. So everywhere that skepticism is little bit more higher over there. And therefore, even the feedback and how we perceive feedback, especially negative feedback, also becomes a little harsher in that sense, a little bit more sensitive to criticism and negative feedback coming in, because everything very heavily loads on the feeling that a feeling of a sense of failure, and that sense of failure is not necessarily seen as a temporary thing. In the sense, in the season I'm not performing very well, or this particular training didn't go well, that's not how it will be perceived. It's like, if it's not going well now, then it's just going to get worse from
Worse.
now on. So it's more of a permanent experience. And I think a player and their family members go through this dilemma on a very regular basis, and I'm not sure to what extent the extended environment, the support systems, families, friends, to what extent do they play a role? They definitely play a lot more role over there, because they're not necessarily present every day to perceive the amount of training, discipline that a player goes through as well. So all of these things do matter in ensuring that a person is able to cope, right? So one of the biggest reasons why there can be a fallout of a woman player kind of figuring out their career in, let's say, 3 years, could very heavily depend on these spaces. You mentioned, like, so if male players have job opportunities that opens up for them, what are the opportunities that opens up for a woman player? So that's something that we look into. There's a lot more there is a lot more socio dynamic expectations of women as well. So
I think even men face it, but I think they, I don't know, maybe they deal with it differently in the sense that
mhm,
um, for men, I've also noticed those who tried so long
mhm,
and they have not really gotten to where they thought they'd get,
mhm,
but they continue with this whole, they get married, they have children, and yet they pursue it. There
mm,
is pressure on them also,
mm, mm.
saying, why are you wasting your time on something that's actually not benefiting you? That is also pressure that they face. I mean,
Correct.
very for women, it feels okay, we can move on to the next chapter in our life. I think men are sometimes stuck.
Mm.
They're neither able to move on and they have to move on. So I think that's also a big
That's also
challenge.
there.
Yeah.
It is an entire dichotomy between what we expect off of ourselves, or what the society expects off of us, and what is actually happening in the foreground. So definitely, like you said, male players also experience a certain degree of stress, and then women do as well. It is a very difficult decision to actually take, to say, you can let this go, or and you're passionate about it, but you can let this go. You're passionate about it, and you need to stay. So that is a very difficult decision to figure out when is that right time, and so on and so forth. I feel qualitatively there can be a little bit more leeway that male players get, which female players don't get. But in the event that male players do take that decision to say, okay, I'm going to let go at this point, and I'm okay to move on over there. I think at that point there's a lot more negative feedback from the society. They say, oh, you tried for so long, and so on. But for women, it's the opposite.
Opposite.
There's a
Yeah,
lot more
yeah, fair
criticism
point.
when they are playing.
Correct.
It's a little less later, so maybe that also affects the choices that players make.
Absolutely fantastic points, all of it. So this is as far as this episode of Mindset goes with Purnima Rajan. There's a lot more coming up. We will deal with different in possibilities and whatever the challenges athletes face. And if you guys have anything that you want to ask about, do come onto the comment section and ask us so that we will be able to address it either as a sports person, as a parent, as any of the stakeholders in an athlete's life. Right? If you like what you hear, do like, share, and subscribe to Coach Aarti. See you soon.